Hello everyone, it's Hunter and welcome back to my channel. Today I am back at you with another book video. I am trying to go back and forth between vlogs and lifestyle related videos like books, coffee, motherhood, etc. Just like sit down type videos. So today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my United States of books. Hear me out. In the beginning of 2024, I decided to read a book that takes place in every single state of the United States. I did not complete this challenge, but I wanted to give myself a way to kind of get out of my comfort zone. I won't lie, I really thought that I would just like mark off every state organically by just reading books that I want to read, and then eventually all the states would be covered. But that was not the case. I read 118 books in 2024, and wow, it's 2025, Hunter, get your crap together. But anyway, since that was a challenge I set for myself in 2024, I wanted to share the states that I did read and kind of share some things that I learned about the setting of books while I was going along. So before we get started, I would love it if you guys would subscribe to my channel down below. That really helps me out, and be sure to give this video a thumbs up, and let's just go ahead and get started. Like I said in my intro, I thought that I would find books a little bit more organically. However, there were some states where I had to go looking for books. And I do primarily read in the romance and thriller genres, so I find that some of the states were a little bit more difficult to find. So let's just go through the states that I did have a book for, and then we can go from there. For the states, I am going to go in alphabetical order, and I read them. The books that I wrote down are the first ones that I read chronologically through the year, so it's not necessarily the only book or even the best book that I read that took place in that state. It's just the first one that I came across that happened to be in that state. So let's start with Alabama. I did not find a book in Alabama. I did not find a book in Alaska. Also, the clouds are moving, so if the light changes, I'm sorry. Arizona, I did have a book. It was The Sorority Murder by Allison Brennan. Arkansas, I did not have a book. California was Keep Your Friends Close by Lucinda Berry. Colorado was Wedding Party by L.R. Jones. I did not get a Connecticut book. I did not get a book in Delaware. Florida was The Light Pirate by Lily Brooks Dalton. Georgia was So That Happened by Katie Bailey. Hawaii was I Still See You Everywhere by Lisa Gardner. Idaho is Maggie Moves On by Lucy Score. Illinois is She's Not Sorry by Mary Kubica. Indiana is The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. I did not have an Iowa book. Kansas was Running Mate by Leah Brunner. Kentucky was Beg, Borrow, or Steal by Sarah Adams. Louisiana was First Lie Wins by, hold on, I gotta look up the author. Some of these I have the author written down, but some of them I don't. Ashley Elston. Maine is The Only One Left by Riley Sager. Maryland was Mary Jane by Jessica Anya Blau. Massachusetts was The Teacher by Frida McFadden. Michigan was Funny Story by Emily Henry. Minnesota was Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. I did not have one for Mississippi. Missouri was After Dark by Minka Kent. Montana was Unwanted by Mia Sheridan. I did not have one for Nebraska. Nevada was All the Little Raindrops by Mia Sheridan. New Hampshire, I did not have one. New Jersey is Middle of the Night by Riley Sager. I did not have one for New Mexico. New York was Hedging Your Bets by Jane Dinker. North Carolina was In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead. I did not have one for North Dakota. Ohio was Like a Mother by Mina Hardy. I did not have one for Oklahoma or Oregon. Pennsylvania is Carnegie's Maid by Marie Benedict. I did not have one for Rhode Island. South Carolina is The Match by Sarah Adams. South Dakota is A Quiet Retreat by Kirsten Maudlin. I think it's Maudlin. There we go. Tennessee is It's One of Us by J.T. Ellison. Texas was Hello Stranger by Catherine Center. Utah was The House of My Mother by Sherry Frankie. I did not have one for Vermont. Virginia was Things We Left Behind by Lucy Score. Washington was Good Half Gone by Taryn Fisher. West Virginia was Apple Cider Slaying by Julie Ann Lindsay. Wisconsin is Home is Where the Bodies Are by Geneva Rose. And lastly, Wyoming is Happiness for Beginners by Catherine Center. So, also, some of these I did read in the last, what's today's date? The 19th. Today's January 19th as I'm filming this, so there are some books that I did read for a little bit of January because I'm still keeping track, because I still want to hit all the states, but, so like, The House of My Mother by Sherry Frankie came out on January 7th, so I did not get an advance copy of that, I just finished it, but it takes place in Utah, so, even though it's not fiction, that's not the point. Anyway, so yeah, those are all the books that I read in states of the United States. So now let me share some countries that I noticed there were a lot of. I actually went through every book that I read and took note of the countries and then how many books that I read took place in each state. And so first let me go through the countries. There were, out of 118 books that I read in 2024, there were 18 books that had unspecified locations. If the location was unspecified, it means that the city that it it named was like fictional and it didn't give the name of the state. I did notice that typically they were giving certain vibes, like certain areas of the country, but not specific states. So some of them gave like West Coast vibes, some gave Northeastern vibes, that kind of thing, but they were not specific in which state they took place in. And then there were 13 books that took place in England, which is not surprising, mostly London. There was one book that took place in Italy. I read 5 that took place in Canada, 1 that took place in Ecuador. It was Americans that took a trip to the Galapagos, which is in Ecuador. I wrote fictional non-area. I guess I don't even know what that means. Like, I literally have no idea what that means. I don't know what I wrote down. Like, why did I write that down? I have no idea what I meant when I wrote that down. One book took place in Australia. One book was in, like, a road trip across the United States. One book took place in Thailand. One took place in Bora Bora. One took place in Greece. And one took place in Belize. So, lots of countries. So that's fun. But now I wrote them down in the order that I, like, read them in. So this is not alphabetical, but in New York, there were 9 books, and I noticed that a majority of the books that took place in New York were in New York City, but there were a couple that were upstate, so they were not all in the city. There was one book that took place in Pennsylvania, one that took place in West Virginia. North Carolina surprisingly had 4 books. Something I noticed about the North Carolina books is that a lot of them were in the mountains, even though there is more beach than mountains in North Carolina, which I thought was interesting. I also think that North Carolina is a popular state, and I noticed this with Georgia as well. A lot of the cities that they use are fictional towns, and I think it's because they're like in the middle of nowhere and you can kind of just make up a city or a fictional town in like the North Carolina mountains because there's just like a lot of really small middle of nowhere towns. So I think that that's why there's a lot in North Carolina. Also because it's easy to do like Appalachian towns, I think. And I think the reason why there are so many fictional towns that I have come across is because the author doesn't have to do research on an existing town. They get to completely create their own town. They get to create the layout of the town, and if they're making a small town, of course making that would be easier, because if you come across someone who lives in a small town and you like put it on the map, you one have to do research on it, but 2, those people are going to be really confused because it's just hard to make up a story about a real small town. So I think most small towns are fictional for that reason. There were 2 books in New Jersey, 3 books in Washington, 1 in Kentucky, and that was a fictional town, 1 in Montana, 1 in Nevada. It primarily took place in Nevada, but it also took place a little bit in Mexico. There was 1 book that took place, actually 2, I finished another one, but 2 books that took place in Florida. There were 3 in South Carolina, and I live in South Carolina, so this is what I found interesting. I have never lived on the coast. I live 4 hours from the coast, or 3.5 hours depending on which beach I'm going to, but it takes 4-ish hours to get to the nearest ocean from where I live, even though I still live in South Carolina, and I actually live an hour and a half west of where I grew up, but it still takes the same amount of time because of the highways, and there's not a direct highway. Like, you have to take a bunch of back roads from my hometown to get to a highway that takes you to the beach, whereas I live off of a highway that will take, so it's literally just like the longest road in the world. It's not really, but it feels like it. But all 3 of the books that took place in South Carolina were coastal towns. 2 of them were directly in Charleston, like downtown Charleston, and 1 of them was a fictional small beach town that was close to Charleston. 3 books were in Virginia, and they were all in like the DC area. So were they really, I mean, like, they actually like were in the state of Virginia, but anyway, there were 12 books that took place in California, and a majority of those were in Los Angeles and other Southern California areas. And I think it's because there's just like a lot of information out there about Southern California, Los Angeles particularly. 1 book took place in Colorado. 2 books took place in Texas. 2 books took place in Illinois. Both of those books took place in Chicago. There were 4 in Minnesota because I read all of Abby Jimenez's books, and those took place in Minnesota. There was 1 book that took place in Maine, 1 that took place in Wisconsin, 2 that took place in Idaho, which I was surprised by, 1 that took place in Michigan, 2 that took place in Georgia. I also thought there would be more books in Georgia because of Atlanta. 1 that took place in Louisiana, 1 that took place in Hawaii, 1 that took place in Kansas, 1 that took place in Ohio. The rest are all 1. So 1 in Ohio, 1 in Massachusetts, 1 in Indiana, 1 in Arizona, 1 in Missouri, 1 in Tennessee, 1 in Utah, and 1 in Maryland. I truly thought Tennessee would also have more because of Nashville, and also because they use the North Carolina mountains so much, like just authors in general. I thought that they would also use maybe like the mountains in Tennessee. Like Rocky Mountain State Park is it Rocky Mountain? Smoky Mountain. It's the Smoky Mountains. Because Smoky Mountain State Park, I just thought that more would take place there. So for the states that I didn't get anything for, before. Let me go to where I have that. Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, all of those states I found to be very heavy on Southern lit, historical fiction type things. Because let's be real, those are all Southern states that are very much, I don't know, they just have a lot of deep history in those states. So those 3 states, and then things like North Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, Oklahoma, also very heavy on historical fiction, and historical fiction just isn't a genre that I'm drawn to. The Pennsylvania book was a historical fiction, and I had to go look for that. But I found that I was having a hard time finding books in North Carolina, Nebraska, not North Carolina, North Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa that I was interested in, just because they were a different time period than what I am interested in reading. If I read a historical fiction, like my favorite books of all time actually are historical fiction books. I love Daisy Jones and the Six, that's historical fiction, and A Thousand Splendid Suns is also historical fiction, but A Thousand Splendid Suns takes place in Afghanistan, and maybe that's why that's more interesting to me, and Daisy Jones and the Six is like the 70s, so I think maybe that's why it's just a little bit more modern than a lot of the options. So like Carnegie's Maid was about the maid in Andrew Carnegie's house with his mother, and I think that maybe it was definitely a harder read. I think that historical fiction is harder to read, but also I just find historical fiction can be boring if it's not a time period you're interested in reading about. I don't know. I don't know. The Plains Estates are not really for me, and I feel bad about that. But anyway, I don't know what was up with Oregon. I really thought there would be more books that took place in Oregon. And then again, New Mexico, historical fiction. I'm just not really into a ton of historical fiction, and that's pretty much what all of the states that I didn't get are Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and Delaware. Well, Delaware is a tiny state, so whatever. But Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, I really thought there would be more, especially because I got Massachusetts and New York. I just thought that the Northeast New England area would be a little bit easier to get stuff, but I was struggling. So anyway, that is my 50 states of books. Yeah, that's all I have. So I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.